The Over the Top, Under the Radar end of year Christmas special is happening. It's a live event. It's the 11th of December at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre, Tottenham.
Tickets start from £8. We have Labour MP Belle Ribeiro Addy joining us. Don't miss out.
Hi, I'm Carys Afoco.
And I'm Gary Young.
Every week, Gary and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. And this week, we're supported by Faber.
Gary, I saw you last night. This is not normal for us.
Yes. A big night for the Over Under pod team. We can call ourselves the award-winning podcast.
That's true. Although it was a bronze award, so do we count that?
It was a bronze award, but that's still an award.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't get to stand on a podium, but we did have our names flash up on the screen in big text. So I think that counts for something. But can we talk about the more important thing? I showed you how good I am at getting canapés, and I think you need to tell the listeners about my gift.
Is it a gift? I mean, she stands like a cheetah, but in all of her finery, in all of the clothes that you kind of wear if you're going somewhere where they serve canapés. So she stands like a glittering cheetah. First, she locates where they're coming from, and then she just pounces on the people that are serving them like they are the antelopes and just eats her fill. I guess that's a skill.
Gift, not a skill. I mean, maybe it's a skill because I've honed it.
I feel like you just want it more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty accurate summary, listeners. What you have to understand is I love canapés, but they're very small. So you can't just have one or two. You need more. I've got a system, process, a way of ensuring that I am near the source of the canapés.
Is that really a system, though? Just find out where the kitchen is and stand outside it.
It's not just finding where the kitchen is and where the waiters come out. They have routes, Gary. And you've got to be on your toes. And then you've got to know what's in the canapés. You've got to know which ones are the good ones. Like there was a vegan sausage roll. But let's be real, was nothing to write home about. There were mini burgers, which were, very good. Yeah, anyway, I mean, so yeah, we won the award, got dressed up. I wore a sparkly cardigan. And most importantly, we feasted on the finest canapés that the audio industry had to offer.
Yeah. And given that, we started in May and we're up against all kinds of people who've been up for longer, who are better funded, but just basically not as good looking. So I think that we mostly won it on our looks, I think.
That is what the
judges said behind closed doors.
Yeah. They were like, entre nous.
Yeah. If it was best looking ensemble,
then,
we'd have been there.
We got some listener messages, tweets, X's, content.
Joanna Ramiro, who was on Twitter and said, loved the Over Under pod, covered the crisis in Mozambique with great detail and nuance. Only note is that rather than Podemos, Gary should be saying Podemos or Podemos, as it's a Portuguese-speaking party, and that helps differentiate it from the Spanish party.
You can find us all over social media, be it Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, or X. Our handle is always the same, @over_under_pod_. We have also joined Blue Sky. You can find us just searching Over Under, because the handles work a little bit differently there. So yeah, get in touch, follow us, tell us what you think about the show. Big shout out to the people who signed up to Patreon this week. We've got quite a few new sign-ups. I'm going to read all their names. Jenny, Matthew, Imrua, John, Susie, Katie, Robert, Nick, Mick, Rachel, and Bobby. Thank you so much for your support.
We have 345 paying Patreon supporters, and we are grateful to all of you. You are backing something new, a bit different. So thank you to all of those who have helped. But now we have a new target of 400 Patreon subscribers to reach by Christmas Day on the 25th of December. Packages start now at just £5 a month. So if you want to keep the show running and access our weekly bonus episodes, weekly newsletter, exclusive over-under WhatsApp community, search Over the Top, Under the Radar at Patreon and put your money where your ears are. So, Carys, what is your under for this week?
Thanks for asking, Gary. So my under the radar is the cost of children in the care system. Maybe it's a bit of a cheat in terms of under the radar. It's a story that Channel 4 News ran with based on a Freedom of Information request that they placed, looking into the cost of running children's homes in England. So one of the things that can happen to you if you are a child or a young person who can't live with their family of origin is that you might end up in a children's home. And one of the things that happened about 10 years ago now is that provision of children's homes was privatized. Channel 4 News investigation found that the amount that we are spending on residential children's homes in England and Wales has gone up by 137% since 2018. If you're wondering why the cost has gone up so much, there is a pretty straightforward answer. 83% of children's homes are run by private providers. The estimates are that they've made over £300 million in profit since 2022. I remember when the coalition government effectively privatised part of the Child Protection Service, privatised children's homes. It's only fair to note that the idea was first floated under New Labour and piloted under New Labour. I remember it happening and I remember thinking there's not a lot of objection to this. There aren't a lot of protests. And then realising that's because they were privatising a service that was used by vulnerable children. And, you know, we're always going on about needing to save money, like it's costing us money. It's sort of 2009 to 10, local government spending on looked after children was 3.1 billion, 2022 to 2023, 7 billion. So local authorities are getting screwed over by these private companies. Young people aren't getting the support and care that they need. And yeah, we're really not talking about it as much as we should be. So that's my under the radar.
I mean, first of all, it's a scandalous idea that you should be allowing people to make money from caring for vulnerable children. Secondly, it doesn't save money. Whatever else it does, it doesn't save money. We can see that. The experiences that I've had in that world, they're not very good at it. I'm not saying that for every single care home, but yeah, my experience was that they were not that good. We have to get away from the idea that you can and should make profit from certain things. I guess I would just add a couple of things. And the first is that when you get this kind of thing wrong, you can end up destroying someone's life because they don't get the start that they need. And you end up paying even more down the line. They're more likely, the percentage of people who are in prison who are in care, the percentage of people in psych wards who are in care. The second is the disproportionate number of people in that situation who are black, brown, and or poor. And so this is an undermining of where the burden falls particularly heavily on certain groups. If you add it to the underfunding of youth clubs, to the underfunding of child and adolescent mental health services, to the increase in tuition fees, and all of the other ways in which we are underfunding our youth, then it's really kind of criminal.
And I think we're going to hear a lot in the next few weeks and months about, because of Elon Musk and his infantile department that he's going to be quote unquote running. I don't think he can. Yeah, we'll see the logistics of that given all of his financial interests. But you're going to hear a lot about government efficiency, the size of the state. There's going to be a lot of demonization of public sector workers in the United States. And I think it's really important to have examples of this. The profit motive, whatever you think of it, is very good at making money, but it's not very good at doing things that are really important to us as a society. Like, it's not very good at taking care of people. it's probably not very good at working out whether children need to be in a home or whether they should be in foster care or whether they should be with their families. Like, even just the incentive of having people who are presumably making money per child in a home, like, you can instantly see that that's not something you want in a system of looking after vulnerable children and children who, for whatever tragic reason, the state is their parent. The state is the person that's taking care of them. Who among us would want someone who's trying to make money to be heavily involved in decision making about our children? I know that we have private nurseries and I know that the private sector is everywhere, but the idea that it is appropriate is just kind of scary. And I think until we kick the private sector out, I don't think that we're going to be delivering the care that people deserve. What you got for me, Gary?
Well, my under the radar is by-elections. In America, you call them special elections. For those who aren't in the UK and don't know, a by-election it could be that someone has died or in some way moved on. So it's elections that take place outside of the regular election cycle. And these are local by-elections. But to me, they're a canary in the mine, as they say. Since July 4th, in Britain, Labour has lost around 40% of the council seats that it has defended in by-election. So since it won the election with a huge landslide in terms of seats, but actually less votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019 in what was supposed to be the most disastrous election ever, significantly less votes than he got. Since then, in the by-elections, it's lost more than 40%. The vote share fell in 80% of the by-elections, and it fell by at least 10% in almost half. There are 101 council by-elections, and they lost seats to everyone. I think it illustrates the degree to which the election was a defeat for the Tories, not a victory for Labour, and the fact that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer's popularity, you're supposed to have a honeymoon when you win, and they didn't get a honeymoon. There's been no love. It was a loveless landslide, they call it. He's now deeply unpopular. Now, there is an element of the left that will kind of jump with glee and say, see, we told you, they stood for nothing apart from power. Their sole kind of real ideological message is that we will trash the left, and now they have, well, we told you so. The hipsters, last week when I said that I was long over woke, you called me a hipster. Let's call that the hipster faction of the left. But actually, it's a real problem for all of us. And while I don't really like much about Keir Starmer, I need them to succeed on some level, because the alternative is the kind of despair that will ultimately, primarily, unfortunately, benefit the right. Some of that disaffection may go the way of the left, but most of it won't, is my guess. We have to be ready politically with some answers, with some organization, with some hope, because there is this kind of sense of learned hopelessness in those figures. And in just the same way as after 2019, I certainly thought, well, with a majority like that, the Tories are in for the next 10 years. That was the general point of view. And I kind of thought that was true. But actually, like a fish, it kind of rotted from the head down. And you can see that taking place with Labour. This idea of kind of creeping hope in the next, I don't see it happening.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I think I do agree that I haven't heard any coverage about by-elections in the UK. And typically, I think what the media do is you don't really hear about by-elections until we're in the run-up to a general election, and then every by-election is like a verdict on whether people are going to win. And we saw that with Labour. So, for example, the Uxbridge by-election, there were a lot of endless analysis and commentary. We definitely over-analysed Uxbridge, in my opinion. But I guess it sounds like these are all council by-elections. So I think there is a good reason to not pay too much attention in that they're going to be super low turnout, and they're going to be subject to specific local political contexts. I mean, the amount of time you spend talking about parking in council by-elections is not insignificant. I think there is a reason we're not hearing a lot about them. And I guess I'd be interested in why you think that, given it's not the same number of people that turned out, whether we can be definitive that it's a verdict on Keir Starmer's government. I don't think they're doing well, to be clear. I guess I'm just poking on whether this is the thing that will tell us that they're on track to lose the next election, because it's not typical of the people that will turn out to vote in 2029 or whenever it is.
And I guess I would say, first of all, these are by-elections all over the country. So the sweep is all over the country. The losses are all over the country. So it's saying something more than just what is happening locally. It's the beginning of a trend. I don't know who's going to win. I am the person who says, just describe, don't predict. What I am describing is actually quite rare at this point in any government. And it chimes with the plummet in his popularity ratings. So one could understand each local by-election separately, but there are more than 100 in this particular cohort. I think that's enough to make a generalization about where we are, given that it's all over the country. And one could separate it from all of the other opinion polls about Keir Starmer's popularity and about how Labour's doing nationally. But I think that would be a mistake, and that these local election results chime with everything else that we are seeing and hearing about Labour, which is a profound early disillusionment. You're not supposed to be disillusioned this early. This is not one where I'm saying the press should be reporting on every local by-election. And this I got from quite a long article in the FT. It's more that it's a story that is going under the radar. And by the time it emerges, it may well be just kind of completely calamitous, but we can see something happening. We wouldn't track each particular by-election, but when 100 tell a story where Labour's losing 40% of the seats that they held, that's a significant sign.
Gary, we're going to talk about your books. There are two that I have in mind. Dispatches from the Diaspora, that came out pretty recently, and then the other from a couple of years ago, Another Day in the Death of America. And I wanted to talk about the inspiration behind both of them.
Yeah, so the inspiration behind Dispatches from the Diaspora, which is a collection of pieces from my journalistic career, and that covers everything from my reporting of the first election in South Africa in 1994, where I followed Mandela around, weirdly managed to stumble into his entourage, to Hurricane Katrina, interview with Stormzy, Black Lives Matter, interview with Angela Davis.
And most importantly, you got drunk with Maya Angelou, and you write about that in the book, which is, come on. And then Another Day in the Death of America. It's funny, it's a similar device, but it's really, I don't know if you call it a polemic, but it's much more, it takes one issue, which a lot of us read about or hear about, which is gun crime in America, and it looks at the edges of the different ways that gun crime in America impacts people.
For that one, I took one day at random and then looked at all of the kids who had been shot dead that day in America.
It's not, an easy read, but it is, I think it does really honour the children and their families. And we've got a special offer today for the over-the-top, under-the-radar listeners. So if you want to gift one of Gary's books, then you can get 30% off right now, thanks to Faber. If you go to faber.co.uk/author/Gary-Young. And you have a special code, podcast30, that you just use at checkout, and you'll get 30% off your books, which is a very good deal.
So that's podcast30 for 30% off. faber.co.uk/author/Gary-Young. Remember, Young's got an E. A thoughtful gift that won't break the bank. What's not to love? So my over is Ukraine. We are all smiles today, where things have really kind of escalated in the last week. On Monday, US President Joe Biden removed the US sanctions on the use of a kind of weapon system that would allow the Ukraine to basically reach further into Russia. The Ukraine has been firing UK-made Storm Shadow missiles into Russia for the first time since the beginning of the conflict. Britain's decision to approve those strikes was made in response to a deployment of 10,000 North Korean troops on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Ukraine now claiming that Russia launched an intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time. That has been questioned about whether that's true. British officials are saying that might not be true. Even if it's not true, the making of the claim is significant, even if it's not as significant, obviously, as if it was true. And now you have Russia basically saying that it, quote unquote, reserves the right to use nuclear weapons to respond to conventional attacks. Where have we heard that before? Reserve the right to defend yourself. So we are in a very precarious situation in Eastern Europe. I think that this situation emerges from the outcome of the US election. Donald Trump has said that he will effectively defund the arming of Ukraine. One of the things that is too rarely discussed about Donald Trump's offer is isolationism is central to that offer. When he says make America great again, that is partly about withdrawing America from many of its foreign entanglements, not all of them, but many of them. And this is Joe Biden trying to ramp it up before they go. I think that that is deeply strategically problematic. It's not as though Russia will be repelled between now and mid-January, which is when Donald Trump will take office. That is unlikely to be the outcome of this. So then all you're really doing, and America is the major funder of this war on the Ukrainian side. So all you're doing is rattling this hornet's nest and then walking away. I am utterly opposed to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and think it should end and they should return to their borders. I'm also utterly opposed to the current Ukrainian leadership for a couple of reasons. It couldn't find its way to understand how its occupation in any way related to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, while it was demanding its right to defend itself, while Zelensky was demanding his right to defend Ukraine against foreign occupation, they still absolutely 100% backed Israel, which suggests to me then that what they're saying is freedom for us, but not necessarily for anybody else. They're also carrying out Ukraine a proxy war in Mali, actually, where there are Russian mercenaries, and the Ukrainian spokesman is kind of hinting, boasting that Ukraine was involved in repelling. There's a separatist war going on in Mali, and the Russian mercenaries have been involved, the Wagner group, and Ukraine has been weirdly involved in providing the kind of intelligence that is ramping up that war. Not helpful. Finally, I want the same thing, actually, in a sense, for Ukraine that I would want for the Middle East, which is I think that we need to be working towards a ceasefire. There needs to be a ceasefire, not more war.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I feel like we haven't spoken about Ukraine on the podcast before. Two things that I wanted to talk about. One is, you didn't mention it, but it's a bugbear of mine, so I want to see if it annoys you. I feel like we get a lot of coverage of Ukraine, and I just think that we've really gone over the top on the details of the missiles. I feel like there's a lot of breathy, the K94853, which has got a range of this and was given by this person, and a lot less on the geopolitics. So your point about Mali, which I didn't know about, feel like receives barely any coverage. And it feels like a lot of this conflict is about kit and tech and less about the geopolitics of the situation. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about that happened in the last week that just sort of made me feel like, where are we? Up is down. Donald Trump's isolationism and this presumably being an attempt to put certain things into place before Biden leaves, was Donald Trump Jr.'s use of the phrase military-industrial complex. And Gary, like, he tweeted it. I mean, he tweets a lot of wild stuff, but the recent thing of like the military-industrial, I'm paraphrasing, but like the military-industrial complex is trying to like lock my father into conflict in Ukraine. I was like, oh, well, that's one I'm going to have to dissect, because the military industrial complex is real. And I find it so strange having like people on the right talking about it. And I think we are going to be in some weird positions with Trump's isolationism.
I mean, I think where the kit's concerned, I would have agreed with you before this week. This week, I think actually the kit matters because it's about where it can reach, and that the kit speaks to the geopolitics because both America and Britain had denied him the permission to use them. And now they're saying, okay, have at it. The fact that they are saying, yes, okay, you can do this now is an escalation of the war and speaks to the geopolitics. And the Russians are responding in kind. So when you get to the point where nuclear kit is said to be like on the table, then I think you're in a different geopolitical situation. And there's been some issue about the Americans and are based in Poland, which really kind of at that point sort of, you have to hark back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was a sovereign country. It had allowed Soviet kit in Cuba. The Americans didn't like it because it was too close. This is, it's not like we haven't been to that place before. I think you're right about the military-industrial complex, the weirdness of this situation. It won't be the last one. And it speaks to a kind of, if you read Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, the degree to which, because certain space has been ceded, the right can in moments sound like the left, or it can contort certain positions so that they masquerade more or less as left positions. Anti-vaxxers who talk about, the pharmaceutical industry and the dangers of the pharmaceutical, which they're absolutely right to talk about the dangers of the pharmaceutical industry. It doesn't make them right about COVID vaccines or Donald Trump's opposition to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has kind of been a real problem for Mexico, has driven down wages in America. This was something that was introduced by the Clinton administration, and it's a problem. It doesn't mean that he has a solution, but the way that these things can be framed, coming back to the military-industrial complex, it's like, well, if they were really serious about that, they would be applying that principle to the Middle East and to Israel as well, and they're not. So they're not serious about it, but it does ring a bell. It does occupy a certain place, and it does get approval from certain sections of the electorate who say, well, yeah, why are we spending all this money over there when we have so little over here? And what are we getting for that money? It's a real problem, and escalating this with the view, I can only assume, that it will lead to something more propitious for peace within the 2 months until Trump takes over, I think is kind of crazy.
So I'm going to try and make my over a little bit upbeat.
Have you got a beanie?
I haven't. I actually do own, I do already own some knitted hats. I don't know if they'd be classed as beanies because they're probably a bit big.
Beanies
but
are knitted?
No, didn't get a beanie, but my over the top is the farming protests. And obviously farming, maybe not the most, well, is it upbeat or downbeat? I mean, we're going to talk about Jeremy Clarkson and there's got to be some laughs in that, right?
That's offbeat.
Yeah. So basically, I'm a bit sick of reading about and like listening to the reaction to the Labour budget proposals. So for those who haven't been paying attention to any news, in the recent budget, one of the changes that Rachel Reeves announced was to change the inheritance tax rules around farms. At the moment, and this has only been in place since 1984, since 84, if you own a farm, you haven't had to pay inheritance tax on it. So Gary, you own a farm, Gary's farm, and you pass away tragically, and your children can have the farm without paying any tax on it.
Can I just say, I'm really glad that you added tragically to me dying in your scenario. That was very
well,
kind.
It's, this, I didn't want, I was like, shall I give a scenario? And I was like, that's a bit gruesome. But just in this hypothetical world where
I'm
you
dead.
are a
You
farmer.
just killed me. I'm a dead farmer. Please continue.
Yeah, you're a dead farmer and your children who survive you get the farm, no inheritance tax. So if you run a factory or own a house, you could be looking at like 40% inheritance tax, depending on how much it's worth. If you're a farmer, it's fine. Just pass it on. The change that Labour wants to make is that you will be subject to some inheritance tax if your property is worth more than £1 million, and then you'll be taxed at a rate of 20%. So still less than other people. And if you have an issue with payment, you can spread it over 10 years interest free. Sounds pretty reasonable. Farmers are still going to have a massive tax advantage. If you had a £5 million farm, Gary, you've really done well with the sheep and the cows and no other property. Under this, you would pay £470,000 in inheritance tax under these new rules that come into effect in a couple of years. If you had a £5 million house, you would pay about 1.6 million. So still a pretty whopping discount. But as anyone who has opened a paper, turned on the TV, listened to the radio will know, farmers are very unhappy about this. They have protested in Westminster, tens of thousands of people. And obviously, everyone has a right to protest. I will snarkily note that these protesters have been treated with a lot more compassion and grace than environmental protesters or people who are protesting genocide in Gaza, people who often turn out in larger numbers but are often not really considered people who have a right to protest. But farmers have a right to protest. We all have a right to protest. I get that Jeremy Clarkson is a very media-worthy person. Tractors make for good pictures on TV news. So I'm not shocked that we're covering the farmers. I'm a little bit shocked that we are allowing them to parrot their side of the story with very little interrogation. For those who aren't aware, Jeremy Clarkson owns a farm. He bought it to dodge inheritance tax. He's on the record saying that. Another famous farmer who's opposed to changes is James Dyson. So the reality of what's happening is this was a huge tax loophole, which a bunch of rich people exploited because they pay accountants and lawyers to help them to minimize their tax burden. The Labour government is closing the loophole while still allowing preferential treatment for farmers. The farmers have got to run their campaign and they're going to say, this is terrible. It's going to be awful. How dare you? There's been lots of very effective language around children and we feed you and we're not profiteering. You're punishing family farms. Fine. That's what you got to say. You don't want this to come through. But I would like for some journalists to point out this is bollocks and that the people who will be affected by these changes are incredibly privileged. And even if all of their money is in the land and they won't have money, 10 years to pay a tax bill interest free, the rest of us would love that. So yeah, I'm over the coverage. I'm over just seeing Jeremy Clarkson on the telly. I've been over that for a while. It's not going to stop. But yeah, the idea that someone who bought a farm in order to dodge tax is a good spokesperson. I mean, he is because he's getting loads of coverage, but it's left me feeling pretty cold, Gary. I like farms. I think farmers are a good thing, but it's not reasonable to expect to not pay tax.
No, I mean, anyone who's going to be taxed more might protest. I think they might. As we know, tax me, baby.
You wouldn't.
I
You'd be
wouldn't.
partying.
I want to be taxed more. And
you'd throw a thank you party.
I would,
tax him.
I would.
He wants it.
So long as
he's asking for it.
I'm gagging for it. And where are all these things going to come from if it's not from the public purse? The thing about Jeremy Clarkson and his farm, it's 1,000 acres. These are not poor farmers. These are generally very rich people who want to keep all of the stuff. And we can't keep all of the stuff. We have to put some in the pot so that society can carry on. There is a potential for real peril here, although I don't think we have the kind of rural militancy that they have in, say, France or Spain or Italy or elsewhere on the continent, where farmers produce a really strong political cohort. Doesn't mean that they couldn't, but so far, particularly in this country, they haven't. There were elections, I think last year or the year before in Holland, where the kind of rural farmers party did really well. And they didn't have great politics about other things either. And quite often in these circumstances, the rural is set up against the urban. And the rural is portrayed as a kind of idyll, as being monocultural, monoracial. the essential England, UK, whereas the cities are set up as dysfunctional, multicultural, multiracial, the dystopia, the future that nobody wanted with the people that nobody wanted in it. There is a potential of peril, although there isn't the history to suggest that this would become a major thing, but it could. I mean, remember the Countryside Alliance, which kind of burned brightly, but then didn't necessarily go anywhere.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the things that just made me feel annoyed. It's like the entitlement. When you think about things like the children in care story, the entitlement of people who are paying no tax, that they should not pay any, and that being asked to pay some is this like affront, is something that I struggle with. There is a sort of setup. A few people in the protest were like, well, we're going to get militant and watch out for these woke people. I think then in the tone and the tenor of the protests, there's like a lacking of empathy, and unless we can empathize with one another and feel like we are in a collective project together of like a state, a society, a nation, none of this stuff makes sense, right? I personally think inheritance tax is a really important tax. It's one of the ways that we redress the huge imbalance that there is. If you get to pass all of your wealth on to your children, then your children are locking in all of the privilege they have. And I think we haven't made and won the argument for that. So yeah, it feels like the farmers want empathy and they feel very entitled to their tax breaks, but it's not clear to me that they're showing the solidarity or support that would mean that I should feel much of it. And also, like, if Jeremy Clarkson's your bloody mascot, then you've lost me at jump. He also once said that public sector workers that went on strike should be shot. I think he wrote it back, but Carys remembers. Just bad egg. So it's just steal your word. I just think he's a bit of a git, you know?
Git.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd like to thank Faber for supporting this episode.
If you want to support this show, then find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon and give us what you can afford.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And connect with us on socials at over_under_pod_.